Hello everyone, this is Serious Trivia, and today we're continuing our Fall of the Han lore series with episode 4, titled Same Start, Different Ending. Now, we ended our last episode with the death of Emperor Liu Zhi, who despite his overindulgence, left behind only 3 daughters and no living sons. This left the court scrambling once again to look for a distant relative to take over the throne, and this critical decision naturally fell onto the now Empress Dowager Dou Miao and her father Dou Wu. Now, if we remember from our last episode, Dou Wu was originally strongly in support of the scholars during the party incident, and it was he who ultimately was able to convince Emperor Liu Zhi to release those who were arrested. So one of his main political agendas was to restore some of these banned scholars back to their original government post. And at the same time, it wouldn't hurt to pick a young emperor whose mind was still malleable so that Dou Wu can ascend to become regent, much like General Liang Ji did not so many years ago. So after an extensive search, he and his daughter, Empress Dowager Dou Miao, settled on Liu Hong, who was a minor duke, just 12 years old at the time. And an added bonus was that Liu Hong's father had died while he was young. So outside of his mother, who was a nobody, Liu Hong had no real support. Now, the image of Liu Hong we see here is how he will appear in the Mandate of Heaven DLC. But at this time in history, we really have to reimagine him more like the unprepared kid he was, suddenly thrusted up to become the emperor to fulfill the ambitions of other people. But let's ignore Liu Hong for now, as he had no real power, much like when his predecessor Liu Zhi first ascended the throne. The real power once again lied in the hand of the newly self-appointed Grand Commandant Dou Wu, who quickly promoted Chen Fan into the position of Grand Tutor. Although we are hearing his name for the very first time in our lore series, we have already covered his story in our last episode. At the time, Chen Fan was a respected elder statesman in his 80s, who was the chief prosecutor in charge of the party incident trial. And when we discussed in our last episode how the chief prosecutors of that case refused to put the likes of Li Ying on trial, we were actually talking about Chen Fan here without naming him. So we can already guess what the Grand Commandant Dou Wu is trying to do as he starts to appoint allies of the scholars throughout the high court positions. And if we can guess this, then surely the eunuchs also knew as well, as they cautiously monitored Dou Wu's every move. And in May of the year 168, not long after the new emperor ascended to the throne, an eclipse happened, and Dou Wu and Chen Fan used this natural phenomenon as an opportunity to advertise against the eunuchs, as they and many other scholars wrote a joint article to inform the public and the emperor, explaining how this eclipse symbolized the eunuchs blocking out the sun, which represents the emperor. And in private, Dou Wu and Chen Fan secretly invited many of the victims of the party incident, including the scholars' leader Li Ying, back into the capital, despite the imperial decree placing them under house arrest, as plans were being drawn to storm the palace and kill all the eunuchs. However, as these plans were being hatched out, there were a few key dissenting voices. First, the Empress Dowager Dou Miao, who had grown accustomed to living in the companies of eunuchs, didn't agree that all eunuchs should be killed. And even her father, the Grand Commandant Dou Wu, had some doubts about whether their plan would be supported by the public opinion, as he wanted to spend more time to gather more evidence against the eunuchs before storming the palace. So this plan lingered on for 3 to 4 months until one of the documents related to the plan was discovered by a eunuch on the night of September 7th. So 17 high-level eunuchs led by Wang Fu and Cao Jie immediately gathered in the palace, as now their lives were at stake. Unlike Dou Wu, the eunuchs moved quickly as they shut down the palace, took the emperor hostage, and used his imperial seal to transfer the command of the imperial guards to them, as they marched towards Douwu's residence with the emperor in tow. But Douwu was also prepared, as he had his armed forces on standby outside of the capital, and the two sides was set to clash on the streets of Luoyang. However, fate would have it that at this very critical moment, General Zhang Huan and his western forces just happens to return to the capital after a long 5-year stint in the Liang province, holding back the Qiang and Xiongnu tribes. Now, the Imperial Guards and Douwu's forces may be totaled 1,000 on each side, but Zhang Huan's army numbered in the tens and thousands. But not only did he outnumber both sides, his troops were also battle-tested from years of fighting on the western frontier against fearsome nomadic horsemen of the Qiang and Xiongnu tribes. So, Zhang Huan's support was certainly going to sway the outcome of this conflict. Unfortunately for Douwu, Zhang Huan hadn't been back in the capital for 5 years, as he was the administrator of the frontier commandery of Wu and the protector of the West. So he missed out on the entire party incident and had no information on the backdrop of this event unfolding in front of him that night. All he knew was on one side was the Grand Commandant, and on the other side was the child emperor. So naturally, he sided with the emperor, and without bloodshed, all of Douwu's men laid down their arms as they knew they had no chance against Zhang Huan's men. And seeing the end nears, Douwu took his own life on the spot. So once again, the eunuchs prevailed against another regent grand commandant. And their revenge didn't stop here, as the Empress Dowager was soon placed under house arrest and died not long after, while Grand Tutor Chen Fan was also executed for his role in this attempted coup. General Zhang Huan would eventually learn what he had done that night and come to regret his actions, as he refused the title of duke that the eunuchs tried to reward him with. Now you might think that finally the party incident is over, but actually things are about to get a lot darker, as the eunuchs have scored a resounding victory over the scholars with this event, and they were not going to let the scholars off easy. With the child emperor completely under their control, the eunuchs used a small criminal case in the following year to once again make claims that the scholars are banding together into a party. This time, all they had to do is educate the clueless young emperor on how these scholars are bad for the country, and how they only want to ruin the country by killing all the eunuchs, who clearly only care about the well-being of the emperor. And sure enough, Emperor Liu Hong, who had spent all his time surrounded by these caring and nice eunuchs, agreed, as he ordered for the arrest and execution of all these so-called party members throughout the country. By the end of the year 169, over 700 scholars were either executed or have fled into exile in faraway provinces in the south, and this ultimately cemented one of the only periods of Chinese history where eunuchs ran the country. Now, I'm sure when General Douwu and Empress Dowager Dou Miao had handpicked Liu Hong, who was both young and without support because his birth father had already died, they imagined a life very similar to that of General Liang Ji and Empress Dowager Liang Na. But in the end, the eunuchs, after first tasting power under Emperor Liu Zhi, had grown accustomed to the politics of the court, and they had the one critical advantage of always being with the emperor. As a matter of fact, it was Cao Jie who had first traveled to Liu Hong's hometown of Hejian to pick him up and return him to the capital to ascend for the throne. And Liu Hong was just a normal pre-adolescent teen at the time, who had grown up without the intense curriculums of a crown prince, and definitely preferred to playing with the eunuchs in the west park of the imperial palace than studying classical literature and how to run a country with the strict grand tutor Chen Fan, who was well in his 80s. And the eunuchs' complete victory over the scholars in what will become known as the Second Party Incident in 169 only made Emperor Liu Hong's education going forward much worse, as the eunuchs kept him entertained with silly novelties like donkey-drawn carts that the emperor could drive around in the west park of the imperial palace, or dogs dressed like government officials. When Liu Hong finally hit puberty, he would expand the scale of the west park and build thousands of new buildings there to surround a man-made lake where he had made swim around nude for his own entertainment. But unlike his predecessor Liu Zhi, beauty was not what Liu Hong craved, as he was fascinated by something else: money. And to find out how far this fascination with money went, come back tomorrow as we'll continue our lore series, exploring the systematic corruption put in place by Liu Hong himself that ultimately broke the Eastern Han Dynasty and led to the Yellow Turban Rebellion in the year 184.